other that I've done before, I noticed that the most people, I mean, to be fair, YouTube's obviously the most people, but after YouTube, it was probably,
We are
it was
live.
probably, yeah, it was probably X, I imagine, is actually the biggest one. But it was.
Jason, everyone telling me where best to stream to, but we are streaming with Jason to Substack, Facebook, and YouTube is the point. But we're going to be talking about
X.
Welcome back, everyone.
Just do X, I'm telling you.
Just do X. Just do X, apparently. But how's it going, everyone? Welcome back to a stream on Russia-Ukraine with Jason J. Smart, someone who we had on. I can't remember the last time we did a stream with you, Jason. We'll have to look through some of the history, but I think good while ago now. And goodness me, what's happening in Russia right now? In the past, 24, 48 hours, we've had Andrea. I always get his surname wrong. He's resigned, right? One of the most top economists in Russia has been forced out because of his revelations. I think that's a pretty big deal. Or do you think it's not really much?
Well, I mean, he said something he shouldn't have said, so they got rid of him. But yeah, it was simply stating the obvious, which is that the Russian economy, given the current state, it's not going to expand or improve because they ultimately are having to choose between the commercial and the private sector and financing a war that's become unaffordable. And as the budget continues to be way over budget, they're emptying out liquidity from everywhere that they can. It's depriving the private sector. Interest rates are extremely high. It's affecting most every aspect of industry in Russia, whether it's oil, coal, manufacturing, retail. 1 in 10, I just read actually a couple hours ago, 1 in 10 malls is expected to go out of business in the next few months or next year before 2027. That's pretty significant. It's a short period of time. But I think it's also interesting to note that this is occurring on the backdrop of a country that has very few other options. It's not like there's other industries opening. It's not like there's a downturn in the economy, which you expect to patch yourself up and get back to it. There's no reason to really think it'll just come back organically. There's nothing going on that would lead to that sort of a conclusion.
No, there isn't, is there? I just find it bizarre that, well, okay, actually, let me start again. Why would they publish this? One thing that didn't make much sense to me, who published it? It seemed like the Kremlin greenlit the comments that he made to be published, therefore indicating that he didn't think that, or the Kremlin didn't think that there was much in there that could be embarrassing to Putin, embarrassing to the...
There's been a lot of things recently. I mean, the economist who just got fired, I think you're referring to, he was, keep in mind, he made those remarks actually a few weeks ago. They just started circulating them widely. And I'm not clear as to context. I don't know if there was a private meeting and it got out, but either way, it's out now. I think there's been a string of things that have been published recently, which is indicative of a larger problem. Who is making the decision to release the polling results, showing that there's now a large percentage of the population that does not want to vote for Vladimir Putin's party, United Russia, Единая Россия. It's about 27% right now. I don't know who gave the okay at the Kremlin to release that, but they did. I think it's interesting that Vladimir Putin's public trust is incredibly low now. I mean, relative to Vladimir Putin, it's quite low at this point, and it's indicative of somebody else making a decision that, yeah, we're okay with that. We're okay with the idea of publishing something that just, I mean, I would have thought just a couple of years ago would have been impossible. So who made the decision? Where is that coming from? Who decided to release videos where you see that Vladimir Putin is clearly of bad health? Who's making decisions to release videos showing that he's wearing clothes that is too large for him? He looks sort of like a child. Someone's making a decision to release these videos, to release these different mistakes on the part of Putin. And I think that's probably indicative of the fact that within his own ranks, there are people that he should probably not be trusting. And he himself is probably oblivious to that. I don't think he's aware of the situation as a whole.
No, he's not. I think it's rather obscene, the levels that he's going to just cover any and all his tracks. The state of the Russian economy right now is just, I don't really have words, to be honest. We cover it almost on a daily basis, right, Jason? You cover it even more than I do. How bad does this look compared to every other time you've looked at it in the past few months? Like, because it seems to be the Russian, no, but how much worse can it get, right? It continues to get lower. And
Yes, I guess the path to death is a slow one at times, but we're getting closer all the time. The patient is not recovering as expected, and that's because ultimately I think that there's just such a number of compounding factors. Once again, it's not like there's one industry that's doing badly in Russia. It's an entire structural problem. When you consider the fact that the banking sector is an example, I think it's the most important one by far. The lack of liquidity that they have, so much so that we saw that Spear Bank is saying that they will not buy any more war bonds because they don't have the liquidity for it. You look at VTB Bank, which is the number 2 bank after Spear. It's about 20% of market share. That's 1/5 of the banking sector. They have over $10 billion that owed by Wildberries. Wildberries is quite literally going up in flames. That's a big problem. That's something that could very well knock them out. If that were to occur, that's something that will affect the rest of the banking sector. But look at other industries. Look at housing. Look at home construction. That's totally collapsed. Shipping's collapsed. That, by the way, is also affecting Russian Railways. Russian Railways has $52 billion of debt, and that just keeps increasing. They've cut all their investment in doing things like fixing their own tracks and things, or modernization, I should say, of the tracks. They've also cut all investments in future projects. When you look over at the other sectors, let's look at the people, there's the common people in Russia. This last month, they took out a record amount of money. It was 40% more than the month before. When they're taking out money, I mean, they're taking out cash. They're taking them out of the banking system, a banking system that's already deprived of liquidity. So it only compounds the problems they have there. The irony of this is that the government, by turning off the internet all the time, makes it impossible to use things like credit cards as well, which is contributing to people's need for cash, which then just hurries up the worsening of the banking system. But all these things are interrelated parts. I mean, the government has taken huge, huge loans from the private sector and from the banks in order to finance the war. We're talking billions upon billions. That money will never get paid back, and everybody understands that. And because it'll never get paid back, that's a problem. It's one of the reasons that Putin, I think, can't end the war. If you were to end it, what would happen with all these banks? They would have a ton of factories which they help to finance the creation of, to, let's say, make tanks, that stop making tanks. Well, why would you possibly pay back those debts? Just bankrupt. And that company's gone. Nobody really loses anything. Well, if you're the guy working in the factory, but if you're the bank, you're just up a creek. And they are forced to give out these loans to companies that otherwise would have been considered to be high risk. They would not have received any sort of favorable status, of course, but they got incredibly favorable loan deals because the government was interested in seeing more factories built. But the government itself, trying to raise liquidity, in Q3 of this year, where we are right now, they're supposed to fundraise about $16 billion in order for the national budget. At the last 4 auctions, they've had to sell government bonds. 2 of them got canceled. One of them, they were not able to reach an agreement with the investors. The investors wanted more money, and the government was offering a lot of money, a high percentage, but it wasn't sufficient. And in the last one that they had, out of the billions they were supposed to raise, they were only able to raise 9% of what their goal was. So they're missing totally their target. In fact, the government overspent already as far as this point in the year. It's 72%, 70% over what it's supposed to be. Last month, we saw a record number, the highest number since 1998, of investors who are selling their government bonds. These are all signs that there's a lot of systemic problems within the economy.
Yeah, I mean, I was just simply going to say that when the entire war economy is supporting the civilian, when it's completely lopsided, when you're spending 1/5 of what the government's revenue on war-related issues, it's not something that you can do for much longer. And the state of of Putin's attempts to clamp down on freedom of expression, freedom of information, simply just reporting on the state of the economy, let alone reporting on the state of the front lines. It's I don't see how this can continue much sooner. You know, you talk about it on a much more intricate basis than I do. I look at more of the sort of systemic changes, and one of the biggest elements to all of that, Jason, is the Chinese. The amount of reliance the Russians have now on China, or the fact that they're having to import energy. This is the energy superpower that is supposedly Russia, from India. What's going on?
Well, India as well as Belarus, yeah, they're getting it from a few places, but it's sort of funny that they're having to get their refining done abroad. But I think it's also interesting in the case of the Chinese. I mean, the relationship there is so uneven. The Chinese, what is it, about 2% of their trades with Russia, about 15% of Russia's trade, though, is with China. But more to those ends, the Chinese understand that having a weakened Russia is in their interest. Vladimir Putin has tried to play hardball with them, or try to be friends, I should say, more than play hardball, try to play friends with them. And they haven't taken him very seriously. I mean, they did not go along with his Power of Siberia 2 project, which was his big hope. And that was the big hope. If he can just transport gas directly from Siberia to China, that's a buyer. There's a great market. It's a growing market. But now it's not going to be a possibility because the Chinese wanted to pay the same amount that Russians pay domestically for gas. And that's not going to be profitable for Russia. So it wasn't very interesting for them. But the project itself was expensive. I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head. But the Chinese were unwilling to, pay for it themselves. And Putin was left empty-handed. Those talks broke down. So we're seeing time and again the Chinese are not bending over backwards to help Vladimir Putin. And I think that the Chinese themselves also realize he's very foolish. They would have, I think, been much more strategic, and they're looking at what he's got himself into and realize that it truly is a quagmire from which he will not be able to get out.
Yeah, there was an article, I think, of the Wall Street Journal. I'm doing a video inspired by it, which was about the Chinese are literally working with specific individuals. Maybe you have some insights, Jason, on a replacement, a post-Putin Russia, right? Because I don't think the Chinese want to sort of become the administrators of some kind of stateless territory, although they may well want to influence the country as a vassal state. I don't know if they want to literally govern it. So what's your take there? How much do you think the Chinese have direct sort of pullings of strings beyond just Putin at this point?
Well, I think that it's a very good question. And I don't know for sure. I can say that the Chinese, though, do have an incredible amount of influence. And increasingly, Russia itself has opened it to that. We've seen that they've made a lot of pushes to expand Chinese language learning in schools, to abandon other languages like German or French or English even. And I think that's probably not a very strategically wise decision, but it's what they've chosen to do. And as that is expanding, I think it's just a sign of them trying to ingratiate themselves to the Chinese more than it's really about trying to improve the quality of education. It's just trying to show servitude to the Chinese. Now, at the same time, there's another aspect of this, which is that the Chinese understand that having a Russia that's willing to do anything for them is sort of useful. We just saw that Vladimir Putin visited the Sakhalin Islands, which are it's under Russia's rule at this moment, which used to be part of Japan. He was just there last week. Japanese were not happy about that. And I think that was very clearly a signal to China, though, that if there's a future conflict with Japan or in the region, that they're on the side of China. I think there's a lot going on right now, which is Russia, again, trying to signal in the East that it wants to play a role there. To the degree that it can really play a role is a different question totally. But at present, Vladimir Putin has very few other cards to play. It's not like he's got a lot of allies in Europe. But the Chinese, I think, are also strategically wise. Look at what percentage of their economy, their trade, is with the United States and Europe versus with Russia. It's scores more with the West. So are they willing to risk sanctions and everything else to become Putin's pal? What can Putin offer them? Nothing. And why would you really risk anything for him if you can get it all for free? I mean, you're getting the milk. Why buy the cow? In this case, why would you want the problems of Vladimir Putin could bring you, the sanctions he could bring you, if right now he's already going to sell you whatever you want at the lowest price possible because he has no other options? And I think that they are able to take advantage of that. And they are, ultimately, as always, looking out for China's best interest and try to figure out a way that they can take advantage of the current situation that Putin has found himself in.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think the Chinese now account for 35% of Russia's total foreign trade at this point. That's a much larger share than in the past few years. And certainly the Chinese have always been very long-termist, right? In thinking about things beyond purely a reckless reactionary standpoint that the Russians or the North Koreans do. That's why they've never really gotten closer with the two, Russia, Iran, North Korea. They all have those strategic partnerships. But the Chinese, okay, they have a unique relationship with the Iranians, but that's mainly from the economic standpoint, isn't it? So oil and stuff. But when it comes to Russia, very little really comes from it more than just simply what the Chinese can reap from Moscow. So what I'm interested in, though, is as the war has gone on, we seem to have seen a little bit of a variancy there, Jason, in the sense of Xi has been trying to distance himself, but at the same time, they do provide increasingly more lethal forms of aid to Russia. Right? It's not just finance or materials; it's arms and intelligence and stuff like that. Right?
I mean, they haven't been so involved in that. They've been more involved in allowing the dual use goods is usually what they're called out for. They're usually called out for just the general trade. I mean, they also sell things that are critical for Russian industry. For instance, there's some chemicals, which have very long names I can't remember, which the Russians buy and are key to the Russian oil industry. And it's the only supplier that they have. So if those factories, if there's two factories specifically, were to stop selling to Russia, that'd be absolutely catastrophic for the Russian economy. So the Chinese don't do that. It'd be nice if they did, but I don't expect them to. And the Chinese, all at the same time, they also want to signal, I think, to the West. It's very important for them to show that they are not completely doing what the West wants. They show that they are sovereign and they're not going to be dictated to by the West and its demands, what it does with Russia, that it operates independent of that. For the Chinese, they would view that as a strategic imperative, I would imagine.
Yeah, no, it certainly is. As I say, I mean, there's a lot of debate on what China wants. Is it a status quo power? Is it a country that simply wants more balance with the US? Does it want to be a regional hegemon? Does it want to be the global hegemon? There's so many variancy here. I think it's a mixture of status quo and regional dominance. I don't think it wants to take up the mantle of sort of what, maritime security guarantor like the US has been reverting from. But what's also interesting, Jason, I think, is that in the first, quarter, 2 quarters of this year, the Russian economy has rebounded. It grew by about 1.3%, but the deficit doubling, and there's been a significant shift in oil gas revenue as well. So what do you make of that rebound? Is that just simply because of some short-term economic interference that the government has done, or is it actually because the Russian economy does have resilience?
No, it was, according to Spirit Bank yesterday, it's 0.1%. So I don't know what they reported, but that's probably due to inflation. Inflationary, that would make sense, or that number would sort of match up with what the inflationary thing would be, which would be reflected in that, because the economy as a whole has not reflected that. We've seen two different things. If you account, which they typically don't, but if you account for things like inflation in the country being very high, the official rate's much lower. But the real one, for instance, there's Professor Hankey at Johns Hopkins who's estimated it's really closer to 26%. And you can estimate this looking also the basket of goods. If you just look at what's publicly available and try to give a good bet as to what it is, it's probably much, much higher than what's been reported. And it most likely is much higher. Just think about the way the economy is structured. You're taking out money from the banks, you're giving to businesses, the government's printing money to give back. It's just a circular charade. It's not really a natural economy. And also, who's buying rubles right now? There's not like a lot of global demand. There's a lot of ditching of rubles. I mean, we've seen 5% loss in the value of the ruble in the past, 8 days. So I think that's probably a very good sign of how things are going. They're burning their foreign currency reserves in order to maintain the stability of the ruble. I just was reading that there's an economist, oh gosh, give me a second. He's well known in Russia, though. He was estimating that it's going to be about 110 ruble to the dollar in the next few months. And it seems probable. That's assuming that, of course, their current problems continue, which I see no reason to think they won't continue. Q3, they did have a benefit from the fact that oil prices went from $40 a barrel to where they are now, which is substantially higher. But at the same time, they're down 25% in production. And at some stages, even higher than that. So how much are they able to export oil? Well, look at what they're doing with the Indians. The Indians are giving a massive discount to, because Indians demand a discount in order to trade back to them the gasoline that they refined in India. So if they say that is a sale and they don't record that in their overall economic picture, and they just conveniently leave out that, yes, we're selling oil, but we're buying it back, well, it's sort of a big deal. You should probably mention that. Keep in mind, it's about 40 to 45% of the national budget of Russia is on oil and gas. How's that doing today? Who are the major consumers? I think it's a little bit more complex than what the Russians would like to portray.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, look, I'm just looking at some of the data here. I mean, the inflation has been at 6%, but services inflation running at about 10.5%. Grocery prices are up 18% from 24. And what I find kind of nuts is that the Russian government are trying to say that everything's under control, but they have to interfere in such extreme ways. They've set the official dollar rate at 85.1 rubles, and the euro rate's rising to 98. So these are small moves, but certainly demonstrates the deterioration of the ruble, as you said. So
Well, I think there was an article out yesterday, which, I mean, it was incredible as how I've said a lot of good things about this article today, just because it's essentially saying exactly what I've been saying for months and months and months. There's a long article, but it was almost no example it brought up that I've not talked about at least once in the past week. I mean, every industry that it brought up, the specific numbers it brought up. And the article is by Catherine Belton, who wrote Putin's People. She was a longtime Moscow correspondent. But if you read the article, which I can't remember the name of now, but if you look up Catherine Belton, you'll find it. It's a very good look as to all the different compounding problems that Russia has and how they're very much so interrelated. It's not like it's just one section, as I said, or one sector that's having a problem. It's not something that's just a slow month. It's the fact that things are getting worse and worse and worse. And as they get worse, the government clearly doesn't have a way out of this. The fact that they have a 2.2% unemployment rate is indicative of high inflation, not that things are going great. And now that they're pulling more people out of the public sector and out of the private sector to go off to the special military operation, that's going to create more shortages there. That's why we've seen the influx of people, migrant workers that they're bringing in from India, from other countries in the global south, namely Africa, namely Southeast Asia. And when they're bringing people in, I think that the interest here is the lack of manpower they have. And it's going to be something that gets much worse. But the real manpower problem they have, though, that's going to be long-term detrimental is the educated class. And getting guys for the factories is something they'll figure out somehow. But when we have the educated class, the people who are the engineers, the people that work in computer science, they've just fled. I mean, there's a huge fear of what the future is going to hold. They don't want to be drafted in the military. There's a general sentiment that after the September elections, there will be a full mobilization. You've obviously read the statistics. I mean, it varies a lot. Some people say 500,000. Other people say 800,000. Some say 1.5 million. And all those could be true. We really just don't know. It could be over a period of time, so it's not all at once. They just still don't have the physical capacity to take in that many people at one time to be in the military. But second to that, let's imagine that did happen. Let's imagine that you really did have this massive mobilization. Where are you going to fill up that many jobs in Russia? If you're already having to import people to work at your military industrial complexes, what are you going to do at that point? So I think that's interesting. We just saw yesterday, crossing the border from Russia to Georgia, there was 20,000 people that crossed the border. That is a lot of people. They're not going there for vacation. They're getting out. We saw increasing now that there's been the government clamping down on cryptocurrencies, clamping down on currency exchanges, money changers. And the reason is because people are trying to get out of the ruble. And these are all indicative of things that you see when an economy really is cracking. That's why they put in all these different regulations now that you can't take out all your money from the bank at one time. And they're coming out with new laws all the time to fight fraud, which is just a pretext in order to give the bank the authority to say, we're going to close down because of fraud attempts. And the bank can just close its doors for a while. In fact, there is right now, I'm going to forget the number off the top of my head, but a significant, we're talking hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, it's over 1,600 if I recall, different bank chapters, or what's the word for it? When you have a local bank that's part of a national network, the local chapter that you have, sorry?
A branch.
Branch, thank you. Yes, the local branch. That's exactly what I needed. The local branch. It's the first time I've spoken English today. So it's not coming back to me very easily. But there's, when you look at the local branches, we've seen them close down across the country. They say that they're doing that because, it's more efficient. But the reality is they're trying to prevent people from being able to take out money easily. They're doing everything they can to slow down the process of foreign reserves, especially. Hence why there's the rumor going around, which regional governors are already preparing for, which is that after the elections, they're going to freeze the foreign currency reserves in the country and give people war bonds in exchange. Now, that's something that's going to really create economic chaos, but that also would give the government price sufficient money to keep the war going for quite a bit longer.
Well, I mean, look, there's the consideration of where you get employment. There's the consideration of where you get troop numbers. What seems to me interesting, Jason, is that as the war goes on, we've seen less of a prioritization of minorities and now just towards anyone, any form. Okay, maybe more rural communities, but Russians that are white Russians, if you like, non-Chechens, non-Baluchis or whatever, not Baluchis, Dagestanis, etc. Those are those distinctions are not really happening anymore. So, and I also found the article that you were talking about by was it Catherine? Yeah, Catherine Belton. So in the Washington Post, the Russians are pulling billions from banks, fearing Kremlin will seize deposits for war. When you're making a run on the banks and literally keeping your money in cash because you don't have want it to be in the system, that is as big a, I think, illustration that the Russian public, especially the more educated ones, or at least with access in the cities, have lost faith in the continuation of this war, right?
Well, yeah, I think that's a very fair statement. I think that overall, when you're looking at a situation like what we're seeing now in Russia, where you see people trying to get their money out, they're increasingly concerned that they will not be able to. And they're probably right. They won't be able to. They're going to get burned. Now, what makes it sort of interesting, though, is what it does to Russia in the long term. So in the long term, obviously, it's going to make it a very unfriendly place for investment, but it's probably going to accelerate those who can take money out. Now, Russia, due to just the general way that it functions, the corruption, there are a lot of people who operate already outside the confines of the law. They will find ways to get their money out. Those are the oligarchs, the upper class. Some won't be successful. We just saw the owner of Rosagro, one of the largest companies in Russia, a billionaire. He just had $6.7 billion taken from him by the state very quickly. And that was because right now there's this cannibalization of the elites in Russia. And that cannibalization is part of something that I think is just indicative of the larger fight within the elites right now, within the clans that govern the country, as to what to do now that there's finite resources. There's not enough to pay off everybody. And the Chechens are a good example. I mean, we saw Kadyrov and his group. Look at the increasing role that they have in things, wild berries, by the way. Look at the increasing role in the gold industry, other industries that they're engaged in. He himself in Chechnya has actually the lowest death rate in the war out of any region of Russia, lower than Moscow's. It's Chechnya. And why is that? It's because ultimately they have to be concerned with stability of Chechnya. That is a strategic consideration for them more than what's going on in Ukraine. If things were to really fall apart in Chechnya, then it would really go off the cart. Now, when we look at all these different problems that Putin is facing, though, how does he address them, or how does he narrow down the prioritization? I think it's very clear that he doesn't clearly understand what is really happening. He doesn't have a really strong comprehension of how bad the situation's gotten. I think that's probably the biggest takeaway. Vladimir Putin today is very disconnected from the reality on the ground. He only meets with 3, 4, 5 people a day, maybe. Who those people are? They're going to be people that are close to him, people he's known for a long time. They're also going to be people who generally believe, or people who he has known for a long time. That's first. But secondly, people that have something monetarily or power-wise to gain by him remaining satisfied, by him not believing that things are not going well. Because if things aren't going well, then he'll be upset with them. But they tell him, listen, things are going well. Things are going great. There's nothing to worry about. There's everything is just fantastic. But it's not the case. That's why he's not addressing a lot of the problems. I think when we look at the fact that his circle has become so small, it'll be remarked as one of the things that was truly probably a major contributor to his overall downfall. And the fact that he was unable to receive accurate information, a serious understanding of what's happening, that is a big problem. That's something that is going to create a lot of problems for him, and something that's not going to get better as time goes on. But I think that Vladimir Putin, he has another problem as well. And it's a problem that he is going to be someone who is not going to be willing to accept that he's made a mistake. I can't imagine he's going to ever say, listen, we should have done something differently. I think he's going to continue down the path he's on, and it's going to lead to probably a worsening situation across Russia.
Well, worsening, I mean, well, okay, I'll take a step back before I go into that rabbit hole. I mean, Putin said earlier today that he's going to ensure that wild berries and those affected by wild berries, including the factories themselves, as well as the clients, et cetera, are going to be compensated. They're going to be taken care of. It's all going to be fine. The guy seems to be saying that to everybody at this point. We're going to take care of the pensioners who are seeing their money taken. We're going to see, well, maybe not the oligarchs. Maybe he's not going to help those, Jason. But like, how much more can he pull the wool over this guy's people's eyes, or because he's so far in at this point? But he can't back out, because either he has to declare mobilization because he recognizes the front lines are failing, which means that the war is not going well, or he doesn't initiate a mobilization, but then he recognizes that the front lines are going to be terrible anyway. So that.
I think that the reality is that he's truly one. I think that he is disconnected fully from what's going on. I don't see any evidence that he really has a full comprehension of how bad the situation is. And I think probably some of the best evidence for that, the greatest arguments for that, is just look what we see going on with the meetings he's had when he goes to the front down in Rostov region, which I'm pretty sure he's not going to the front in Rostov, but that's neither here nor there. When he goes to the front, allegedly, I think that the reality is that they are not telling him how bad it is. And the strongest argument for that is look at the maps on the wall. The maps, physically, the maps they have on the wall during these different encounters there, they're not maps that show the front lines as they are. They're showing a fairy tale. They're showing him a Ukraine that's been conquered in huge swaths, which is simply false. It's never been happened. It's just never happened. But they're making up these entire myths, these fairy tales that they tell him, and he seems to like to believe them. He seems to like to believe that things are going well, and he doesn't seek to find more information that would contradict this falsehood that now he believes, and he's entrapping his nation to also believe, though it's based in just hallucinations.
I mean, we always thought that the guy was largely a pragmatist, right? I mean, he wasn't driven by ideological extremisms, but clearly that was never the case, or it's become the case over time, do you think, as he spent more of that time on his own in COVID and stuff like that?
Well, I think COVID was a major contributing aspect of this. Vladimir Putin before COVID was known to be somebody who would go out, seek to get advice on things. He met with people often. His fishka, as they say in Russian, his attribute, his thing, his special characteristic was that he would look for reading people. That's something he always really tried to pride himself in, was that when he goes to meetings, he would try to read people's personality, the way that they acted, the way that they behaved, and try to interpret what was really going on, what it really meant. But as time has gone on, he's not able to do that any longer. He was cut off during COVID. He was using the, Zoom, Russian government Zoom, whatever they call it, and talking to people by that. And he missed a lot of the reading people, telling that they were concerned or not concerned, or were just reading from a paper. And by missing that, I think he did miss a lot of the different signs that people weren't being sincere with him. And there's another aspect of this, though, that's even more important. I think that during his period of time being cut off, he did have a change. His general personality changed. He's become much, I would say, more delusional than he ever was before. I don't think he always had this huge ego. He had delusions of grandeur, probably. But at the level that is today, where he truly thinks of himself as some sort of a almost messianic figure in Russia's history, I think it's very unusual. I also think, though, it comes to another thing. It's probably the larger reason, more than just this messianic belief. It's because he also is dealing with his own mortality. As he faces this, he realizes that Russia's going to be left to somebody else at some point. But more important, and something I think he cares a lot more about than that, is that when he's going to die, he doesn't know. But there are a lot of people that have an interest in making sure that the old Lion King doesn't survive much longer and that they can take power. So he must consolidate power as best he can still and push for it, because there's plenty of people around him who would be delighted to take that power from him. And that's realistic. I mean, and we've seen when there's different uprisings, or I should say different conflicts in Russia, the Prigozhin one, of course, is the easiest example to give that people would readily know, is when the Prigozhin uprising happened, Prigozhin, the Wagner Group leader, was able to travel quite a significant distance. He got to Rostov, starts his way towards Moscow. We didn't see any border guards stop him, police stop him. We didn't see the National Guard stop him, the Chechens stop him. We didn't see the military stop him. In fact, the military generals in Rostov sat on the street with him and drank coffee. We saw that they did not call an airstrike or did not call for his arrest. They could have arrested him. They didn't. We saw the local people in Russia greeted him like a hero. We saw the National Guard, Zolotov's group. They have 350,000, 400,000 people there. They're there to be the guards of Putin, and they're supposed to be domestic military. That's why they have now tanks in Moscow. But that didn't happen. There's actually no confirmed evidence whatsoever that they lifted a finger to try to stop the Prigozhin uprising. But look at the Chechens. They're supposed to be a Praetorian Guard. Where were they? According to the Chechens, they were 100 kilometers away, and due to bad traffic, they weren't able to get there to protect Putin. To me, that's sort of stunning. I mean, he spent a lot of money keeping them loyal. I mean, the Chechens are not loyal to him because they love him. They're loyal because he pays them. I mean, the Chechen government itself, it's 88% finance, if I recall. Let's say close to 90%. It probably goes up and down year by year, but it's 90-something percent is financed by the federal government of Russia. It's not financed, or I should say fundraised, by their local efforts, by the local tax base. And it's because they're not paying taxes, and the federal government is subsidizing them, hence why they have the huge buildings they have and the nice streets and everything. It's because they're trying to keep them loyal. They're trying to buy them off. But I don't know how much longer that's going to work if you see that they don't have the cash to pay off everybody. You saw the tensions that there were about a month and a half ago between Putin and Kadyrov, the Chechen leader. That's related to the fact that there's a lot of lack of money. It seems that the Kadyrov is increasingly pushing for more. Putin has less to give. And the people around Kadyrov as well have gone on a real campaign saying how they're the only people truly loyal to Putin. Putin can always count on them. Listen, when push came to shove, they didn't lift a finger to actually help the guy. So my honest view would be, if I was Vladimir Putin, I'd be very concerned about these people who claim to be his friend.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think we've had a lot of different voices on the show. Most recently, Peter Zine, and he's called collapse quite a few times on different topics, especially China. And whilst I certainly think that things are looking bleak, I don't get too carried away in saying it's the imminent collapse of something. But when it comes to Russia, I certainly think that the North Caucasus, Chechnya, Dagestan, such areas are looking pretty vulnerable. And I could imagine a scenario where those kinds of countries seek some kind of independence, and the Russians don't really have the capacity to do much to stop them. I mean, look at South the Caucasus. The Turkey is really exerting its influence down there now. It seems to be the regional player to beat now, not Russia anymore. Iran has its own issues, of course, but you have to consider their interests in Azerbaijan or influence as well. And then, of course, we touched upon it. The thing I did actually want to drop a quick note, Jason, is that your YouTube account seems to have connected finally, because when we started, no one was joining from your channel, and suddenly we've had like 300 people join. So welcome, everybody, to the correct stream. Jason was sitting random channel.
Some guy named Jason Smith was apparently getting a lot of views today.
Yeah, he was. Jason was very popular with no one watching. For those of you who've joined. Anyway, so we're sort of debating a few different things. But yeah, so I guess my question back to you, Jason, is also, what are your thoughts on, like, to what extent is Russia fragmenting? Like, because a lot of people say it's going to collapse, and the end of Putin means the end of Russia, or does that mean a rump state? Russia that is a much weaker one, but it's still largely together, just not able to exert influence.
I think that Russia overall, I mean, post-Putin, it's going to be interesting to see what happens. Of course, we can't be certain. I think there's a very good chance, though, from the way that things are shaping up, it's unlikely there'll be a replacement, a Putin-like figure that has a centralized control and power in the country. I think that was very unique to him, and he's done nothing to build up a successor. Typically, you'd build up a successor if that's the way things are going to go, but he hasn't really done that. But also, I think it'd be very challenging, just given the current dynamics in the country, to do that. Now, when Vladimir Putin took power, let's remember what the country looked like. The 1990s were quite exciting. There was a lot going on, and there was sort of anarchy, and there was an intelligence service that started to network and to work directly with the mafia, quite literally organized crime, hence where he came into the picture back in St. Petersburg. But either way, when you look at all these different things, it allowed for him to come this extraordinary rise to power, and he became the leader of Russia, connecting both the business community, let's call it, the organized crime world, which was a lot of Russian economic activity back in the 1990s, plus the intelligence services, the Siloviki, the ones that came from a security background. But in modern Russia, it doesn't really have that. But it also has a different thing that's occurred, which is natural. That is generational change. Vladimir Putin, he was born, October 7th, 1952, and he's not going to be around forever. And as a result of that, we have to look at the ones that have come later, the ones who are now the vast majority of the intelligence services, the vast majority of those who are in business are not his peers. They're decades younger than him. And that creates another problem. That is something that's also budgeting. So I think his ability to maintain for Russia to maintain this sort of a system with a new leader will be very difficult. I think it's much more likely to see something sort of like the Soviet Union post Khrushchev, where there'd be sort of a several different people that are working together, or immediately after Stalin, where you see several different people working together to try to manage things and to manage the different interests. But either way, we do see that actively right now, the major clans, those in the intelligence services, they are consolidating as much as they can, as fast as they can. They're swooping up as many businesses as they can. And that's something that's sort of fascinating to watch. The way that they've gone after the elites, the oligarchy within Russia, is sort of shocking. It's also sort of shocking, though, to see that they are so blunt about it. They don't try to hide it. They're very open. We see that 1 out of 8 people that used to be on the Forbes list of Russia have now had their assets taken by the Russian government. That's huge. The leadership of the country is now going after, the former mafia people in St. Petersburg who were actual colleagues, true friends of Putin back in the 90s. They're being arrested. And that's still not very clear as to the whole story there, why he's allowing that, what's actually going down. Or is it simply that they were old friends and today he doesn't need them? He could throw them to the wolves because he can't afford to risk losing the friendship, or I should say, allegiance of the people in the intelligence service. So he has to buy them off somehow. Now, the other attribute of this, though, is how they've done a marvelous job at trying to take away control or power from the military. And I've been talking about that for a couple of years. If you look at how the military has been pushed to the edge on a lot of things, for instance, look at when the Ukrainians occupied Kursk, Russia. During that period of time, the Russian military was given a number of different deadlines. They failed in all of them to expel the Ukrainians. Time and again, they failed. Finally, it was the intelligence service that stepped in and said, we can help lead this because they can't even defend the borders of Russia. And that was a huge loss for them. But also the fact that they had the whole uprising, Shoigu and everything else got replaced, all of his deputies got arrested. That's also a huge black mark for the military. But for the intelligence service, seeing the destruction of the military in Ukraine, it's not necessarily a negative thing. It's quite a positive thing, perhaps. Because their objective is the consolidation of power after Putin. Having people who are armed is not in their interest. Having people who are not armed or a military that's been decapacitated, emasculated, that works very well for them. So I think that's what we're seeing there. If we look at the military industrial complexes in Russia that used to be owned, or de facto owned by people in the military, generals who are giving contracts to their sister's factory that just happens to, to make things that the military needs, that's being cleaned up pretty well. And it's not because they're fighting corruption. They're just making sure that goes to their pockets, not those pockets. Hence why we've seen 17 generals in Russia arrested over the course of the past 4 years. That's an incredible, stunning number. But the most interesting one, of course, was the general, I think it was Popov, was the general who was arrested about 2.5 years ago, is the week or 2 weeks after Ivanov got arrested. But when they arrested him, he's a guy in charge of choosing what your future assignment's going to be, where you're going to be posted for the officer class, the senior officer class. Now, think about what that means. That is the guy who probably receives more bribes than anyone else in the Russian military from other people in the Russian military. So when they raided his house, undoubtedly they found his little black book where he kept down who was paying how much for what exactly, because he's dealing with tons of cash. But that also means they've got compromising material on the rest of the officer corps of Russia. They have the ability to blackmail them and extort them as long as they want to going into the future. They've got them all in a very compromising position. And that's something, again, I think that the intelligence service of Russia, knowing the way it operates, is not surprising, but it's also indicative of the fact that they are not looking for how they unify Russia or something. They're looking for how they can control Russia.
So there is something that I'm quite interested in, Jason, because as someone who's worked and lived in both places like myself a bit, not to your level, of course, something that's been a concern for many people over years is corruption within Ukraine as much as Russia. Both countries don't do great on the transparency index. And there was an article in the Financial Times earlier discussing the fact that Zelensky's fired one of his top aides, a raid on that guy's home after Fedorov was let go, has put renewed attention on Zelensky and those around him. How do you compare the situation there versus what you've just described and everything that goes on in Russia?
I mean, there's corruption in both countries. It's true, but I think it's sort of different. So corruption in Ukraine, I would describe as being typical developing countries. I mean, as you know, the other region I study outside of Ukraine is Latin America. And so when you look at Latin America, it's very similar. It's not a lot different. When you see countries like that, it's usually due to the poor state institutions, the lack of state institutions that have developed over time the way they should have. And I can get a whole thing about how corruption develops in countries, which is a fascinating topic. It's a lot different than many people think. But either way, in Russia, though, it's a little bit different, is that they actually, it's not corruption. I would say it's not. I would say that it's an institutionalized method of governing. And what I mean by that is this. If you look at the way that Vladimir Putin is able to maintain control of people in the country, those are in the elites, it's by allowing them to take money. That's part of the deal. You can embezzle money. It's not a problem. We all understand that you're going to take, let's say, 10%. But with that 10% that you get, you're also being paid for your loyalty. You don't challenge Putin. And that's sort of, as they always say, the deal that he has with the elites is that you don't challenge me politically and I allow you to keep your wealth. And within Russia as a whole, that's something that he's been able to maintain. But the more important attribute of this, I think it's the most fundamental part of understanding the Russian government. And it's something I've think about earlier today was, and it's my own view of Russia has reached the point where I have no doubt about it. But when I was younger, I was like, really, is that possible? Yeah, it's really possible. It really is just a mafia. If you understand it to be what it is, it's just a criminal organization. And what I mean by criminal organization is it does not exist for the benefit of the welfare of the Russian people. It's not serving them as an elected officials who somehow want to see the betterment of Russia. I don't see any evidence for that whatsoever. Russia today, if Vladimir Putin, and by the way, people who say that Vladimir Putin is ideologue, listen, if he was an ideologue, if anyone in his entourage was really an ideologue, they have enough wealth to have defeated Ukraine. When this war began, if they put that money that they've stolen from Russia, hundreds of billions of dollars stolen from Russia, if that had been invested in the war would turn out a lot differently. But they chose not to. They chose over decades and decades to rob the country, to fleece the country. That's where Russia got to where it is today. So overall, why would it continue the war? What is that about? Well, keep in mind, this is something that's allowing some certain sector, namely those close to him, to make more money. Consider the wealth that's been taken in Russia. Out of the $56 billion that's been seized from the elites since 2022, it's 96% of it, if I recall correctly, 96% I think it is, of that money has ended up, or those companies have ended up in the pockets of the oligarchy that's considered to be close to Putin. Not just oligarchy, the oligarchy closest to Putin. There are more billionaires today in Russia than there ever have been before. And in fact, in general, their wealth has increased a significant amount during the course of the war. But if you look at the different assets that they're taking, like Domodedovo Airport in Moscow, the second largest airport, what we see right now is that there is a shift, a truly huge shift in wealth and the possession of assets within Russia. But that's all part of the fact that there is a new elite, which we should not consider to be political, because they're not. It's people from the FSB and associated structures working with the organized crime to go racketeer and to set up different businesses, to set up things. The Black Sea Fleet, who benefits from that? The Black Sea Fleet is not just, it's private industry. It's not the government. It's private industry. When you look at things like the oil revenues and stuff, look at who owns the specific facilities that are getting attacked. These things go back to very specific people. There's names associated with them. So all in all, what we are seeing right now is that this elite, this small little oligarchy in Russia that controls incredible sums of money, is battling over the future of what's going to happen not only to Russia, but to their own pocketbooks.
Yeah, I think, the two main things that come to my mind are that, firstly, the fact that we keep getting notification of these events in Ukraine demonstrates that NABU, SAPU, whatever, are clearly working, or at least doing the work necessary to identify this. And it's backed by the Ukrainian population. The fact that you have people coming out in force to demonstrate, even when they might get hit by ballistic missile fire, is not something that many countries or people might be brave enough to do. The fact that you're still seeing corruption trying to be dealt with during wartime is major. And the other thing I think, Jason, I don't know if you would agree with this, that I think it's a different level, a different type of corruption. In the Russian one is much more structural. It's at the heart of much of the Russian state after the collapse of the Soviet Union, in what you've described and the way that Putin went about seizing and consolidating power. That means that for you to significantly de-Putinize, if that's the word we can run with, Russia, you're going to have to significantly gut a lot of this corruption, which I think goes a lot deeper than the corruption perhaps of Ukraine, because Ukraine has had elections which have demonstrated they've been fair and free, unlike the ones of Russia. So to sort of, they're not comparable in a strictly equal sense, I think. My only curiosity, though, is if you're going to see Putin attempt to purge further, just how much further can he do that before he runs out of things? Like you mentioned the $6.5 billion that billionaire is facing, but I think that there's a growing awareness that that's going to start becoming the norm, right? More and more billionaires essentially donating their money towards the military operation, right? I just
there definitely has been that. I mean, there has been a surge of different people in the elites who are essentially being forced to give money over to the government to make charitable donations to Vladimir Putin's favorite fund. And that's sort of funny on one side. But on the other side, it's the fact that there is clearly a power struggle going on. This is not small. This is very significant what is happening. And it is something that it's ultimately very dangerous as well. I don't think we appreciate the fact that what's transpiring inside of Russia can not only blow up easily, right, really easily, but it's something that will have global ramifications. The Russian government's engaged in crime, and not just within Russia, but it's engaged in crime across the world. We see its cooperation with things like terrorist organizations in the Middle East and Africa, drug cartels in Latin America. When you look at these different factors, these different operations they have, these different actors with whom they work, you realize that it really is a global network they've created. And that global network is one that is not going to go away. It's going to still be there. And there's definitely going to be people who are going to seek to gain from that, to seek to benefit from that. And they're going to continue trying to work with this global network of terrorists going forward. Why would we possibly think that would stop after Putin? It's definitely not going to stop after Putin. Now, the question is, what happens next? Because it's also possible to influence events. We don't have to be passive to them. Now, if we were to influence those events, if we were to try to change the outcome, to drive the country in a better direction, it's probably a very worthwhile effort to make. Because if Russia continues down this path, it is a source of a lot of headaches and problems globally. And it's something that is not going to get better unless we try to actively make it better.
Well, yeah, I mean, I wanted to look at the fiscal picture for a second. So at the current rate that things are going, Russia's on course to double its 2025 deficit, which was already double 2024. The first quarter 2026 has exceeded the government's full year targets. They spent all of what they expected for this year in 3 months, while oil and gas revenues have obviously been declining further because of sanctions, lower export volumes, and the overall infrastructure damage from Crimea. So when we take into consideration, Jason, all those things coming together, everything's coming to collide. How much time does Putin have before even the elite start pushing him to leave? Right? Or it's not that simple. Are we going to see a revolt? I just don't, are we in the Soviet Union 1917 scenario?
Well, listen, it is interesting to me, though, that we've seen, speaking of 1917, the example of 1917 has come up a lot recently in Russia. And we saw that in the parliament, in Duma itself. Gennady Zyuganov, who's the head of the Communist Party for forever, but he was the one who said that if the country doesn't address the significant economic problems that it has, it would face something like a 1917 scenario. Now, that was actually what was repeated by the banker he mentioned earlier, who was...
Klepach,
yes, thank you. Thank you. Yes, Klepach. So what did he say, though? He said exactly that. He said that, if the country doesn't improve, and he used the example in 1917, I think that everybody understands when you use 1917 as an example, Russians have a clear understanding of what that is. It's not a happy thing. It's a very violent change of power and a fundamental change of power. A true revolution. I mean, you fundamentally undo everything that existed before, and then you will be able to have the ability to change or direct the country in whichever way you want to. And I think that's what he's looking for. I think that's what people are expecting will happen after Putin falls. There'll be a much bigger war. That bigger war will be one that will change the course of the country's history.
Well, how much bigger, though?
I think that what's going to happen, I mean, listen, there's a lot of different theories as to what could happen. I think that what is most probable is that given the fact that there are these different fighting groups that are not going to work together equitably, it's very likely that it would spread internally. There'll be a high period of instability. I think that Russia is going to go through several years of very unstable governance. that will have ramifications. It'll be a very violent period of time. And that's not probably so uncommon in a country like Russia. I mean, it has all the right conditions for that sort of behavior. It doesn't have a functioning democracy. It doesn't have courts. It doesn't have a means to address questions to somebody, to be an outside referee. It's ultimately going to be decided by people through brute force. And that's something that's going to be a very challenging period for Russia, but also a very dangerous period for Russia. So what's going to happen next, we can't always be sure, but we can be absolutely certain that it's not going to be a very easy period of time.
No, it's not. I'm seeing a lot of people reminding I'm not very good. We need to do a better job, Jason, apparently, according to the audience, of saying like and subscribe or give it a share or something like that. So do that, everybody, if you feel so interested. If you want to see more from Jason and I collaborating, because I think it'd be nice to talk to you more often, Jason. We keep saying this, but then we keep forgetting to do so. Or I'm just bad at following through and reminding you. But what about, okay, so let's take a step back then and look at the Crimean element of all of this, because I think what's interesting is whenever I do a video about Crimea, it always seems to get a particular amount of interest. People have a particular interest in Crimea. Why is that? Is that because of the symbolism that Crimea stands for? Is it because of the annexation that happened 12 years ago and it sort of that was the first initiation that got people really paying attention to this part of the world in a way that they hadn't done for a long time? Why is Crimea so different? Or because of how it is symbolically towards Russia and Ukraine?
I mean, it's different in the sense. In which sense do you mean it's different?
The importance of it. That if we ever got to peacetime peace talks, that the idea of Crimea is a issue that so many Russians, Ukrainians are going to see differently than just the mainland of Ukraine, for example.
Well, I think reading the Russian military bloggers, I think that it's a lot of that myth that it was really so special, I think is going to change. And that's just because right now, reading the Russian military bloggers looking at Crimea, the people there are very unhappy. Aksionov, who's the governor there, he's viewed very negatively. They've had a total lack of fuel. They've run out of food. They have water. They have very limited amounts of water supply at this point. They have electricity for an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours a day. It's very limited. It's a very difficult situation. Putin has routinely promised that he has everything under control, that he's going to address it, he's going to fix it. And people are seeing that Putin is not able to do that. So that means he's either incapable or he's unwilling or he's lying to them. But in no case does it make him look good. I think that generally speaking within Crimea, we've also seen probably the largest amount of real partisan sort of activity, people trying to blow things up. And I think that's sort of an interesting, I mean, we just saw the former captain of a submarine, Ukraine's only submarine, who defected to Russia, who just got blown up himself last week by somebody in Crimea. So I think that there's a very good chance, there's a very good chance, in fact, that Crimea would come back to Ukraine. And I don't think it's going to be this huge scandal. I don't think it's the history of being tied to Russia. It's a myth.
It's a myth. Oh boy. I remember visiting Crimea in the mid-2000s. We went in a Soviet submarine just in Sevastopol and toured the interiors of it. Quite the remarkable experience. I was only 10, 11 at the time. And then we went around parts of the peninsula, like in the East Coast and the Sea of Azov. It was beautiful. And that was the first time I ever got the courage to swim underwater. I know people are like, that's a random memory, but it remains very vivid for me, and therefore my relationship to Crimea and the symbolism of what it stands for people now. But what is Ukraine's strategy in your opinion there then, just to try and force the Russians to flee, to put so much pressure on Moscow because of what's happening with Crimea that they sort of capitulate elsewhere? Why put so much emphasis on Crimea as a military objective?
Well, Crimea, I mean, as a military objective, it's clear is that it's an incredibly important location. For the Russians and Ukrainians both, it's the future of the Black Sea and who has control over it. But more than, I mean, that's why they had the Crimean War in the 1800s, was for that reason. But when you look at what it means overall, I think that it's at this specific stage, why it has such a significant importance for this war that we're currently engaged in. It's not just because it's the occupied territory, and it's not just because it's special. It's because ultimately the Russians cannot afford to lose it. Polling done in Russia about 2 years ago asked what are the greatest moments in Russian history. And the top three answers were Yuri Gagarin, the first man in space, victory in World War II, and Crimea returning to Russia. So if that's the top answers in a poll, it shows you what the population of Russia feels. So for Putin to lose that, that would be a pretty dramatic loss. That'd be something that would be not just a huge black eye. That would be enough to get your power overthrown. And that would be significant. That would be very significant. That would be such an incredible loss for Russia. There's probably not been something like that. I can't imagine something worse for Putin right now than that sort of an outcome. Now, how realistic is that? I think it's becoming ever more realistic all the time. And they're out of air defense in Crimea. We see now when the Ukrainian drones come in, because we look at the videos, they post them on social medias, they post them on Telegram. You can see that they don't have air defense anymore. You can see that they're running out of small arms fire. They don't have machine guns. According to actually Vladimir Solovyov, the propagandist, he was just saying that they don't have sufficient machine guns in Crimea in order to defend it. So if that's the case, if it's really like that, then that's probably a very good sign. It's going to be very hard for the Russians to maintain. But it's also where they got the Russians sort of in a rock and a hard spot. They can't do anything to defend it. The major roads that go there, like the M18, M21, they've been cut off. The Ukrainians have firepower over it. The small bridges that used to also go there have been cut off. We see there's the Kerch Bridge, of course. The ferries that went there have been sunk. Now, the options they have, the ports are being hit, the airports are being hit. When you look at that, what options they have? Well, ultimately, they don't have a lot of options to actually get things there. And you've seen routinely things like trucks trying to get there, carrying fuel, and they don't go very, very long before they burst into flames. So looking at all that, I think there's a very good chance that Crimea is in a situation that's getting worse all the time, and the Russians are showing themselves to be totally unable to defend it or to try to push the Ukrainians back. There's not much they could do about it.
No, but to be more specific, what I mean is that Crimea has always been symbolic, and it's been under the occupation of Moscow for 12 years. And in all that time, there has been an emphasis on trying to regain control of it by Ukraine. But why do you think the Ukrainians are moving on it now? Why didn't they move on it sooner? Is it because they've developed the capacity with the drones to finally do so? Why are they putting particular emphasis on Crimea in a way that they didn't before? What do they hope is going to lead to a shift in the psyche of Moscow?
Well, it's not just a shift in psyche. I think it's the fact that Crimea, there's got several factors here. One, Crimea is the location from which they launched attacks on Ukraine using the missiles as well as drones. So it's an active threat to Ukraine. That's one. We just saw the attack on the Bastion facility there, and that was significant because that takes away Russia's ability to launch missiles. In fact, increasingly, we see that it looks like they've run out of their missiles there. Out of the last 5 major attacks, I want to say 4 of them did not involve Crimea. That's a huge shift. But either way, when you look at that, there's that attribute. The other attribute of this, though, is that Russia, as I said, for Vladimir Putin to lose Crimea would be truly a dramatic shift. And as a result of that, he has to make sure that he doesn't lose it. So he will expend whatever resources necessary to maintain it. But if you know that your enemy, your opponent, is willing to bleed out almost anything for it, that's what you want him to do. You want to get him to do as much as possible to think that it's really in play, that's the next step, and for him to go all in and trying to protect it. If he does that, he doesn't have enough troops then in Donbass. He doesn't have enough troops then in Sumy direction. All this weakens his overall assault on Ukraine.
Well, let's talk about demographics and the recruitment. As I said before, Jason, I think that Putin is between a rock and a hard place, to put it mildly. He either has to admit that the front lines are not doing well and mobilize, or he doesn't mobilize and the front lines don't do well, or even worse. So it's a catch-22. But how is he going to, how does he do that? Or does he just bring in more and more North Koreans? What do you think about 30,000 North Koreans that are coming over? We've got a guest coming on Friday to talk about the North Korean angle, because also after Trump's comments with the latest report I heard is that he's pushing his aides to develop some kind of renewed meeting with Kim Jong-un for some reason. And there was a fantastic meme I think I saw from someone on Substack or somewhere which was sort of basically highlighting the fact that Putin is getting support from North Korea, who is putting pressure on the South Koreans, and Trump has been tariffing the South Koreans and wants to get closer with North Korea. So sort of basically Trump is all the way towards Putin again, and it's that. So it seems like Trump doesn't know what he's doing either in the longer term
It's
support that he's
amazing.
going to get Putin, right? It's all just going complete chaos.
It's always, yes.
I'm
It's
trying to
exciting to
say
see.
what he's doing, which don't worry,
Uh,
you can't
there's
do that.
with the North Koreans. I mean, the thing that I would worry about with the North Koreans is, I wouldn't say worry. It's probably not the right word. The thing that I think is probably most interesting to watch. I mean, ultimately, 30,000 more soldiers won't change the outcome. Uh, Listen, Russia has a casualty rate that's extraordinarily high. Given their current casualty rate, those soldiers won't be around for very long. Now, but more than that, there's something else that's very important here. They are sending weapons, though. Those weapons that they are sending, like the missiles, there's a few problems with them. The 22 strikes that were on Ukraine last time they were using North Korean missiles, the evidence came out that only 2 of the 22 strikes were considered to have reasonable accuracy in what they were actually able to hit. That's a very bad sign. It actually makes everything a lot more dangerous because it's not like they're just going to hit, the electric plant. It's nobody knows where it's going to hit. It's not like you're hitting a pinpoint in Kiev. It's we're going for North Kiev, Central Kiev, South Kiev, and we'll see where it lands. So I think it's going to get a lot more dangerous for civilians. Now, the North Koreans themselves, though, they've not proven to be very effective on the battlefield. If you're burning through, let's say, Russian casualties currently is about 1,350 per day. You have 30,000 of them, so that gives you 22 days and a half or so. That's not a lot of days that they're going to be around before they're extinct. I don't think that there's a huge threat that comes from this. I think that overall North Korea it gets a lot of talk, and I think it's good that it gets a lot of discussion because I think it brings the world's attention that this war is not being fought just between Russia and Ukraine as a regional dispute or something. Then, in fact, it is a global war, which is what Russia believes. And as a result of that, I hope that there's more attention on the fact that, the problems that Asia faces today with North Korea, they relate directly back to what we're seeing in Ukraine.
I think that, well, on that point, the Russians Putin has said that NATO has been supporting Ukraine throughout all of this, and therefore it's a proxy war, but by bringing North Korea into the fold in a much more shameless way. I remember when you and I had a conversation more or less 2 years ago, when the Russians and the North Koreans signed that strategic partnership of June 2024. Yes, I remember because I'd just got into Spain. It was one of our first ever streams. I remember it vividly. And we were sort of speculating about the propensity for the North Koreans to get involved, right? And now here we are. They are fully involved, and the Chinese support North Korea. The Chinese are supporting Russia. The Iranians are supporting Russia. My concern with this is not even the manpower. It's what you said. It's about the dumb bombs, the dumb missiles, those with unguided, the lack of precision guided systems. Is much worse for Ukraine. Not that Moscow necessarily cares about that, but certainly it means that the shortages that Ukraine has, including with Patriots, is a real problem. So I don't know, as we enter the autumn now, we begin to see quite a lot of shifts in autumn, spring. This is when we see the most maneuver. What do you think happens then? Do you think the winter's going to look tough? It's not going to be good for Russia. A lot of Russians are going to be very, very cold, but I think it's going to be tougher for Ukrainians because of the indiscriminate risks they face from North Korean artillery or munitions.
Right. So, it's really interesting. So I think that there's going to be a few things. On the Russian side, I expect that they will not have enough heating oil for the northern parts of their country. That's going to be interesting. They're still suffering with significant lack of fuel, diesel, and everything else. But I think the other thing that's going to be really interesting is how they try to attack Ukraine. And I think it's not going to be as effective as they would hope. At least that's what I'm hoping. But the reason I say that, not just because I'm here, but because I think that they are counting on all the things working that they don't have the capacity to do anymore. For instance, they simply don't have the capacity to create as many missiles as they used to. They don't have the same degree of accuracy that they used to. So to take out some of the nodes within Ukraine, I hope that they're not able to do as well. Now, of course, they are intending to do that. I have no doubt they will make every effort to do that as they continue to. But I think that there's going to be a much more difficult time for the Russians to achieve their results. Russia, due to its own internal problems, is going to really struggle to keep things going. In fact, look what we just saw with, speaking of the lack of diesel. This is, I think, sort of fascinating. Everybody's brought up the fact that the farmers have to do very soon their harvest for the year. Without that, you have problems next year. But right now, The farmers aren't able to do that due to a lack of diesel. But here's where it gets really interesting. This was just yesterday. The farmers were given a special, let's say, coupons or something like this, where they were able to get some sort of a special allotted amount of fuel, and that's being cut off. And the reason it's being cut off is that there's not sufficient amounts for Moscow and the farmers. So the farmers lose out. That is so strategically unwise, it is unbelievable. But there's a secondary effect to this that's sort of fascinating. If you cut off those farmers, the farmers in Russia, I mean, there's obviously small farmers, but a lot of it's very large farms. They have a lot of foreign technology, a lot of things like tractors and stuff, John Deere or whatever it is. It's expensive to maintain, foreign parts, but they also got huge bank loans to do that. These big corporations, bank loans. But how are they going to pay back those bank loans if they don't harvest and they default? At which point, the bank again sucks that up. The banks don't have the capacity to do that. But you go one step further from there. You look at the Rus Agro, as I mentioned, the CEO of it, the founder of it, was recently arrested. His $6.7 billion taken from him by the Russian state. There's definitely a move right now to take property within Russia, to take assets. And I think that what we're going to see, and it's actually one of the things I'll say to look for in the very near future, look for who tries to take over the land in Russia that comes from the farmers that are defaulting. Because there's two different groups right here. They're going to benefit. Well, one benefits, one loses out on the economic crisis that will be created by the farmers having problems. And those that lose are obviously the farmers and those connected to agriculture, but it's also those in the banking sector. Now, that's one sector of the elites that is different from those from the intelligence sector. The intelligence sector is different. Those guys are the ones I'm betting that will be making a push to take over everything that Russia will have a need for forever, such as agriculture. There's always going to be demand for agriculture. I think they're going to be making a push for that as well. And they're going to use it to their advantage to try to force banks to give more loans to these new farmers or to these new farms. And part of the reason is they're trying to take in as much money as they can. Once again, they're plundering the Russian state. And in agriculture specifically, as I've said before, look at Patrushev, one of the top intelligence guys in Russia, close friend of Putin since the 1970s. His other son was a minister of agriculture, then he was deputy prime minister. But his partner, girlfriend, whatever she is, minister of agriculture, the agricultural bank of Russia, they were looting that forever and ever and ever. And now today that those farmers actually need money that's from the state, not from a private institution, from the state, there's not enough money there because they've deprived it of that. And it's taken away the core function that it had. As a result of that, it's going to create a food scarcity problem within Russia, all triggered by their own greed.
There's not much I can really add to the agricultural sector, if I'm honest, Jason. That's an area you have much more intricate knowledge of than I, for sure. It makes me think a little bit about what we've seen in history and other cases where the state has essentially eaten up every single other industry that it could. But that's already happening, right? The cannibalization of the Russian economy is something that you and I both commented on back in February in our own respective ways. But this is happening more and more, and it's becoming less and less reversible if already it's too far gone. What I'm interested in, though, is to bring in the additional exogenous factors is like Europe. You may have seen that threat by Iran in the past 12 hours, the article stating that supposedly Iran may consider striking bases across Europe. Now, the reason I'm mentioning this is because I think Europe is undergoing a significant shift. It's still on European time, as in it could be quicker, but it is changing. The reindustrialization, the remilitarization in the case of Germany, rearmament, whatever. If we are to see that happening in Europe quite significantly, what do you think that does for the front lines? What do you think that does for Ukraine's capacity to outlast Moscow? Because for me, it's a ticking time bomb of what implodes first, Russia's economy, or not implodes first, what happens first? Implosion of Russia's economy and therefore the state, based on your descriptions, or the support for Ukraine and their capacity to sustain their defense?
Well, I think the reality is that they do have the capacity to sustain a defense. I think the more interesting question is, given the confluence of events that we see right now between what's going on economically and politically within Moscow, what options does Vladimir Putin have? Very clearly, continue to wage an attritional war in Donbass is not something that's operating in his interest. It's just not achieving the results he'd like to see. And so you can keep doing that. It's not going to get them any further. I mean, Russia today is only able to take and maintain control over 13% of the territory for which they fight. So they claim that they have this massive area that they're fighting. They've infiltrated. Yeah, they only actually keep about 13% of it. It's moving today at an incredible rate. It's about 1 square kilometer per day, or less. It's actually less. This month it's less. I'm wrong. It's less. It's now going to be in the negative. Russia losing territory. So when you look at this, I think that they have to look for other opportunities. And I think one of the other opportunities they would look at, or other methods they would look at, is to do something like attack a European country. And that's the view of the United States intelligence as well as European intelligence, is an attack like that would be done for a few different reasons. For one, it would then also shift the focus of the Europeans to no longer talk about what's going on in Ukraine, but to focus more on what's going on in Europe and think about their own defense, their own protection. Once again, going further from there, the idea would be that, let's imagine you carry out an attack in some country that's very friendly to Ukraine with drones. And it doesn't have to, be after the capital or something, but you hit something that's got some relevance. What would happen next? Well, the hope that the Russians would have is at that point, that country would stop contributing air defense to Ukraine because it realizes it needs air defense for itself. And as a result of that, it's not due to the fact that they wish harm upon Ukraine or just don't want to help. It's because they realize that simply we need the air defense right now. We can't afford to take that risk. That's what they're hoping for. That's the sort of thing they would be looking to do. So that's a general argument. Now, would they do that? How did they do that? We can't be sure. But I think that there is a very reasonable expectation that could happen. I'd be surprised if it didn't happen ultimately, because I don't see many other ways that Vladimir Putin could serve a paradigm shift to fundamentally change the calculus of how the war is being fought. There's nothing else that I can imagine him doing. And they put out their red lines all the time about sending assistance to Ukraine. It's changed nothing, absolutely nothing. Now we just saw British-made drones were used to strike across Russia. And what the Russians do? They can't do anything. So they have to do something else. And I think that the best way is reflexive control, going back to the Soviets, reflexive control, to do something that makes your opponent do something in return that operates in your interest. So restricting the amount of air defense that you send to Ukraine is operating your interest. You're trying to help yourself, but it's ultimately serving Russia's interest simultaneously. That's not the intention. I think that's what Vladimir Putin will probably try to focus himself on. And historically, it's the way Soviet Union also operated.
Yeah, I mean, look, well, on the English front, that's not strictly true, though, Jason. The Russians did do something. They wrote her a sternly worded letter. If anything, they actually sounded incredibly British in responding to the British occupation. They did respond. The British, the Russian embassy in London here was very forthright in its criticisms, but in action, yes, we're still waiting on that front. I think that Europe has a lot of capacity. I think that this whole idea that NATO can't exist without the United States, it has the potential. I think NATO minus, this idea that NATO exists without the US. I mean, the US would still probably be there in a dominant position, but I mean, NATO has, if you focus on the European branch, $400 billion between all the economies together. That's more than double that of China. That's more than the Chinese and the Russians combined, and it's nearly 3 times what the Russians currently spend. So the Russians would have to find money on trees to be able to compete with the Europeans, who aren't even in that phase yet. And I think what's interesting, though, is the more the Russians probe, the more this, I think, brings countries round to this sentiment that a lot of the Baltics or the Nordic states have had for a long time, right? Because there's this huge divide between the countries like Italy or South Spain, or those that are not as immediately at risk for Moscow. But when you've seen Leipzig airport at risk from a potential sabotage attack, when you see continuous interferences across the Benelux states or even Romania and elsewhere, that wakes up the entire European state. And now, actually, come to think of it, there's speculation about the Ceuta situation in northern Morocco, right? With the Spanish territory. There's some people suggesting that Russia has been providing that kind of disinformation to try and distract Europe from the front lines with Ukraine towards more of its immigration issues, much similar to the populist movements that we've seen time and again over the past few years, right? Try to bring those
of course.
Yeah, so I don't know. Russia has this ability to exert influence in very how to say, fragmented ways. But it's. Do you really think that they could launch some operation? Why would Russia have the capacity to launch some kind of military operation into the Baltics when they can't even deal anything in Ukraine?
Well, the objective wouldn't be to actually take territory. I mean, once again, it's about what the reaction of your opponent is. Russia's objective is, in most cases, I think that's a fair thing to say. In most cases, it's not going to be about actually taking territory. Like, I don't think anyone in the Kremlin's deluded enough to believe that, we should really go take the Baltic states. I think it's just very foolish. Now, I think at the same time, let's imagine, though, a minimal level incursion. Even NATO planning doesn't plan on an immediate response. It's not like within hours there's a response. Suppose they do this for half a day and leave. NATO's not there to go follow up with Russians and bomb Moscow. It's certainly not. I mean, realistically, I don't see that happening. But I think that there's also something else, is that once again, it causes these countries to restrict the amount of assistance they're sending to Ukraine, because they realize at that point they have to beef up their own security. So this is not being done to the detriment of Ukraine or for the interest of creating, a worse situation for Ukraine. It's simply be done because they think that it's the best solution to have. It's the best thing they can do to protect their own security. Now, overall, though, I think that the Russians have something else going on that's important. Throughout this whole war, I'll take a step back actually to give context to what I was about to say. Throughout this whole war, you'll notice that there's been a lot of things that have been different than what people expected. For instance, when the war began, the Russians expected an attritional war. Russia's got 140 million people. Ukraine had 40 million, about maybe 36 million before the war began. Today, it's like 24 million people in free Ukraine. When you look at that, 24 versus 140, it's sort of amazing what's going on, because Ukrainians denied the Russians the ability to fight in an attritional war. They're unwilling to engage in that, and hence why we've seen that Ukraine is doing something different, whether it was through initially in the war, things like HIMARS, or if it's things like the drones today, that allow them to have a distance from the actual combat, the Russians, which allowed them to preserve the soldiers' lives, and the Russians were taking higher losses, at which point they were expending too much per distance taken to become a winnable war. But those sorts of paradigm shifts, look, Ukrainians moving to Kursk, Russia, where all of a sudden it becomes a defensive war for the Russians in a totally different part of the front. That's huge. But the Russians, they can also try to do that. They can also seek some sort of a shakeup. And as I said, the sort of shakeup they would need would be one that causes the Europeans pause in their support for Ukraine. At present, and as that specific, the guy you just mentioned who got fired, the economist, his exact quote, I don't remember the exact quote, but the exact thing that, yes, he alluded to the fact that
that's a rare one.
No, he was, but what did he say? He said that if Russia cannot win as long as it continues to receive Western support. That's true. He also said that, if they don't change things, and he talked about the 1917 revolution. But the fact that he made stated the obvious, which is that Russia doesn't have the ability to get around Western assistance, is true. So if your objective, if you realize the thing that's keeping you from being able to realize your objectives is that there's this Western support coming, obviously these threats are not working. The lower level stuff that Russia does engage in, it does engage in arson and stuff like that. It's not having the desired impact that I think the Russians were hoping it would have. A lot of their active measures haven't worked as well as they'd hoped, but they are apparently, according to the American intelligence and the Europeans at this point, is that they believe that a larger attack done with a missile, a bunch of drones, would have that desired impact. So, what the United States would do in such a situation, I think, is obviously the big question. Now, the Russians are obviously betting that Donald Trump will do nothing. That's something they are definitely counting on. And that's, I think, probably the most worrisome thing, is that the American leader is very hard to predict, to say it very diplomatically. Or actually, I don't know if you saw the statement from the Iranian government earlier today. They said that it was the American leaders, what was the exact words they used? He behaves like a little child, so it's impossible to have a serious conversation with him, and he doesn't remember what he agreed to the next day. So it's a disaster. So when you're looking at that, and that's what you're really facing, how do the Russians look at this? Well, they're betting on the fact that, there would be a huge conflict, and it's one where, or not even a huge conflict, there could be the potential for a huge conflict, and that would cause pause with the Europeans to do something without American backing, and the Americans might not even give their backing. And that's something I think that is what the Russians are betting on.
Well, I don't think it's a very good bet then, or as we say on the Global Gambit, a good gambit, right? I don't think that the choice of the Russians to think what the Europeans can do. I mean, for a long time, the Europeans have been complacent, and I do agree with Trump on that, running on the back of America for too long. But to sort of underestimate the human capital and just knowledge capacity of the Europeans to do something if they need to is unwise. You're talking about a very diverse and educated and skilled continent with a lot more on the plate, especially if they are going to take seriously. Because I think that's why Moscow should also pay attention. That's why I brought it up, is the Iranian element. As you say, the Iranians are very savvy people based on what they said about Trump. But to underestimate your enemy is what Sun Tzu, you should never underestimate your opponent, right? When he's, or never interrupt him when he's making a mistake. And certainly Europe, I think, would be ill-advised to not recognize that if the Iranians do potentially intend on doing something, which would make no strategic sense at all for Tehran, but even if they did, well, that gives them even more incentive to need to do something to protect against intrusive and interference activities from the Russians and blatant threats from the Iranians. So I personally think that the Europeans are looking more positive. And at the same time, as I said earlier, that you've got this compounding effect of Russia deteriorating. You've got the Europeans investing more, putting more focus, and Ukraine is continuing to build its own in-house capabilities. So I think the two coupled together is only going to increase that potency, right? So I don't know. What do you expect in the next few months? Do you think?
In the next few months? No, I mean, I think that right now for the Russians to do so, they might be premature, but they're obviously testing the waters. And there's it's not by chance that their drones end up over NATO airspace all the time, or that one of their missiles landed in Poland a couple weeks ago, or the fact that airplanes fly into NATO airspace, or that they buzz NATO airplanes. That's not happening just by accident. They don't have Russian hackers routinely hacking things in the United States and across Europe. For that matter, they don't have people getting murdered in Europe and the UK, especially the UK's. One of the most interesting stories is just the degree that Russia has a nefarious influence there is significant. It's well documented. Everybody knows it. Everybody sees it, and yet it continues. So I think that that's something to be very concerned by. But they've been able to, for a very long time, to operate with this feeling of impunity, this feeling that they can get away with anything, and they feel that right now is a particularly good time to behave that way. Keep in mind, they're looking at a U.S. that its leadership is questionable as to what it's going to do. They also believe it's very, very safe bet that there's going to be a problem in Europe to rally enough support that, essentially the Germans will say, well, we're not sure about this. And I think either way, they would wait for the German elections and the French elections, which are in the near future. Those two elections are going to be important. If we see something like the right-wing party in France come to power, if we see AfD do even better in Germany, there's more and more chances right now to have different governments that are going to be less unified. And in reality, I can't imagine Europe really taking a strong position, doing something really dramatic to support anyone if there's not going to be a very strong German position in this, a very strong French position in this. And if we don't see the United States involved, or the United States guaranteeing that they'll at least supply weapons, that really does challenge things. That really changes things very quickly. So when we look at all these different factors, I think it does become a much more complex situation than what many people might appreciate. But the fortunate part is this. The fortunate part is that overall, I think that there is a lot more right now being discussed. This was not, if we talked about this a year ago, I think a lot of people have said it was impossible. But if you look what the Russians themselves have indicated, what they hint towards, they're pretty open. For that matter, just look where their drones are flying, where they're hitting. Is that by coincidence? No, it's not by coincidence. They're intentionally doing that. So if we wish to curb that behavior, we do have mechanisms available to us to do so. And I think that obviously supporting Ukraine is probably the best way to do that, because it has the most direct impact and most influence on Russia's ability to hope to create problems in the future. If right now Russia faces a significant defeat, best thing that could happen to not just Ukraine and for Europe, but also for Russians themselves. I think seeing the total defeat in Ukraine, the liberation of Crimea, would be total positives for Russians in their history.
Yeah, but do you think that that can save the country? Do you think that that can create a Russia that actually is reasonable? The point that I think a lot of people forget is that Russia's never really had a proper diplomatic, democratic existence, right? Maybe for a year or two in the early 90s, but for much of its history, it's been a centralized state in one form or another, be it a monarchy or some kind of, well, whatever the hell the communist shit was. So can Russia exist in a more pluralistic state? I don't think it would ever be a Western liberal democracy, but I think it can have a more that more secular sense with a more decentralized form of governance. I just wonder what that form would look like. You know what I mean?
Is it possible? Of course, it's possible. I mean, Japan didn't have a great democratic history until 1945. It was made that way, and it was made by the United States. So, their constitution wasn't just dreamt up by Japanese dreamers; it was forced upon them. And I think that there are ways that things can change in societies. Nobody would argue today Japan has a problem with democracy. So what happened? How that changed in time? It was due to losing a war. And I think that losing a war does have very real world consequences. And at the end of the day, let's think about it this way. And I think a lot of people haven't thought about this as well. One of the reasons that Putin doesn't want to get out of Ukraine and he wants to see a victory is now he's bet so much on this that if he comes out a loser on this, how will they ever pay back those reparations? I mean, what are they going to do then? So he's got nothing really to look forward to with the current state Russia's in. But Russia, given its own economic structure, what's going on, it quite literally cannot keep going forever. And everyone is seeing this. It's a top story now. And Washington Post, the Times had an article today about this. It's everywhere you go. You're seeing the same stories. Talking about the Russian economy today is reaching a point of structural failure. And as we look at that, that can lead to a number of different outcomes. Now, it's more probable than improbable that the country does not become a democracy in the short term. But does it become a country that's not as aggressive towards its neighbors? Yeah, if it's burnt well enough, it won't do it again.
Wow. Well, Jason, we could keep going, but I feel we've been talking for a good hour and a half. It's a nice way to bring back the sessions with you, for certain. I don't really know what to say. I like to believe that Russia can exist in some kind of alternative form in an alternative universe, but it remains to be seen. Only until Putin is out of the picture, I think, is largely what it is, isn't it? But any closing remarks? Anything upcoming you wanted to shout out?
Well, as I said, I think that the most important thing that people miss, I mean, if you're tuning in, listening to this, and you probably already agree, but I think the people have to understand is that the war that Ukraine is engaged in the perspective of the Russians, for sure, is not actually about Ukraine. Ukraine is a battle, but it's just a battle on what they believe to be a global war against the West. And they do seriously believe that, and they are acting on that actively across the world, whether it's their activities with the terrorist regime in Iran or Hamas, or if it's drug cartels, they're all interrelated. And ultimately, we have to understand that if Ukraine is able to defeat the Russians, if we see Russia lose this war, if we see the downfall of the regime, it is something that will have very positive effects for the global community. I mean, stretching from Latin America to Africa to Asia and across Europe, it will make the world a safer place and a better place. Because ultimately, supporting Ukraine is something that operates in the interest of people in the West, not just of the Ukrainians.
Yeah, no, Ukraine is a symbol of something much larger, that it's a fight of democracy versus autocracy. It's a fight of the form of governance, and to what extent do we want to be independent of tyranny like that? And I think that one likes to believe, perhaps naively, from my perspective at least, Jason, that Russia still could be one day a constructive player. But I find it very tragic the way that the country is going. The man who promised he would restore the, great Russian empire, the superpower that is Russia, is now making it irrelevant. He's making it weaker to such an extent that it is essentially a vassal state of China, and completely second tier to the likes of to others. One wonders, I was reading a very interesting economic article the other week, sort of projections of what Russia's economy could have looked like, what global role it could have played if it hadn't undertaken the war in Georgia. I mean, we can go further back than just Crimea, right? The economy could be the size of Germany's. It could be triple the size, 6 trillion instead of 2.5 or whatever it is. It could be, you know, and everyone talks about Russia being a global energy superpower. Well, it could be a natural superpower, probably, not just a sort of a pet. Well, what was it that McCain called it? A glorified petrol station with nukes. So, you know, more potential there, but that doesn't seem to be the way. And Ukraine is doing the remarkable work of demonstrating how a country can still deal with corruption, develop in-house munitions to such an extent, lead the way in drone diplomacy, helping the Gulf states and parts of Europe, whilst fighting off one of the biggest wars since the Second World War. Absolutely insane. But
no, it's a lot going on.
Yeah, well, right. You never end it, but go for it.
Nothing. I was just gonna say, I agree with you totally. There's a lot, and I think that ultimately, when I look back at history, and everyone always thinks that their moment in history is special. That's true. It's actually true in all of history. Everybody always thinks that. But the world really is in an incredibly complex situation right now. The degree that it's complicated is hard to express. It is truly a very, very difficult situation. But Ukraine has taken a role that I think that history will look back on and realize this was a incredibly important pivot and a decision. There's a decision to either support Ukraine and to support right now as it's fighting. And if it doesn't, though, that's going to be a decision that will ultimately come back to haunt the West in ways that is going to have tragic consequences.
This is a make or break moment. If you want to be on the right side of history and to ensure that we don't just repeat the same old mistakes that we seem to, this is a genuine opportunity to have a constructive influence on what comes after Putin, because there's nothing more I want than to see that guy gone, and to see, as I say, a more constructive Russia. Do I want to get too carried away in predicting that? No. And I would prefer to see the country not fragment, but we have to also be realistic with what happens, right? If parts of it want to secede or parts of it are absorbed by others surrounding nation states, but it will be messy. It will be very messy to see.
No, it'll be messy.
All right, guys, thanks so much for watching. If you haven't already, of course, do subscribe to Jason, both on YouTube and Substack. You do great pieces. What are you writing on Substack, actually, at the moment? Because we've on Substack now.
Well, yesterday we just had a piece come out with Chuck about what's going on the front, and actually there's a piece I'm writing right now. It's about the economy of Russia and the internal fractions within it. Because I think the more that you look at that, it's very hard to argue that Russia has an opportunity to win this war. If the pressure is applied at the right places, the Russian economy will shatter.
Yeah, it will shatter, not just break. It will absolutely shatter. Yeah, no, we have Peter Zion on the show, and we've got David Petraeus coming on next week, and we've got Sarah Payne on as well. So if you like a variety of opinions, but of course, Jason, you'll be back very soon. Then do subscribe, join the community on the Global Gambit, everyone. But thanks very much for watching, and speak to you soon. Take care, everyone.